Prepare now to avoid the dangers of accepting free help in any kind of an emergency situation. Anytime there's a large-scale emergency event, free aid will be given out and many people will have to rely on it. But nothing is truly free, and whatever strings might be attached to that aid could be very detrimental. So in this video, let's talk about historical examples of free aid that actually turned out to be much more malicious. Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and today we're talking about how you can avoid accepting free aid during an emergency by preparing now. And it's definitely something you should do, because nothing in life is truly free, and if something's too good to be true, it generally is. So during any large-scale style SHTF emergency, you can expect lots of free aid to be pouring in. But at a certain point, especially in a long-term scenario, is that aid always going to have the right intentions? Or is it possible that it could be malicious and even more dangerous than not accepting it at all? Once you accept free aid or free help or whatever it might be, there's generally strings attached. You might not have signed up for something right that second, but you may be called upon later in order to pay that debt, or the aid that was given might actually pay you back in a very negative way. So let's talk about things throughout history that kind of give us examples as to what might occur here during a large-scale SHTF scenario. And if you're worried about preparing for these kinds of scenarios and you want to make sure that you're prepared so you don't have to worry about free aid or free help that's being given out, then hit the subscribe button below, because honestly a big part of preparation is to not need any of that stuff because of the repercussions of accepting it and what they could actually bring to the forefront in the sense of your ability to survive, okay? So, one of the most iconic examples of free aid that was given during an emergency situation, as you could call it at the time, is the smallpox blanket situation of 1763, where smallpox-infested blankets were handed out to Native Americans here in North America by British colonists during a siege of Fort Pitt, okay? And Sir Geoffrey Amherst was proposing the idea of spreading this disease-infested cloth, whether or not it's blankets or handkerchiefs or clothing or whatever it was, to the Native American population to try to decimate them. And of course, that was accepted by the people that worked for him in the time. But during that siege, some of the people within Fort Pitt already had that idea and actually sent the smallpox-infested items with the Native American emissaries after they had negotiations, and the rest is history. But this is just a very good example as to how people can utilize aid against you in any kind of an emergency situation. And yes, there's a lot of gray area history surrounding that entire scenario, but what it does teach you is that you could be in a very desperate situation. We could find ourselves in some sort of a large-scale conflict, and some kind of foreign adversary might offer aid and say, hey, you know, we don't want everyone here to perish, so here's a lot of supplies you might need. Are those supplies actually dangerous? That's something that you have to consider, and having to rely on those supplies is a very dangerous situation in that moment, because sending out a bunch of food to a bunch of desperate and hungry people might be an easy way to poison the well, as someone might say. And that is also another strategy that's been utilized throughout history in order to basically take something that provides nourishment and turn it into a weapon. And this is exactly what we need to be aware of. And this is stuff that we need to think about right now and apply to what's happening right now in the sense of compliance and regulation, and what it is you're willing to accept in the sense of aid, and what that might mean that you're signing up for in the future, okay? So, understand that back in 1763, the idea of this whole smallpox thing was because the fort that was under siege had a hospital full of smallpox patients already. And the idea came to mind that maybe that could be utilized in that time in order to help maintain the survival of the fort against the attackers. And that's exactly what was done. Well, this happens throughout history, and this is something we should definitely think about as preppers, because a lot of this stuff could definitely happen again here in the future, especially when we're talking about foreign occupation or some kind of a global conflict. And this is why we need to prepare and not rely on free aid. But we're also going to talk about other things that this applies to here in the modern day. But other examples, just to let you know that this does happen throughout history, and it's something that we should be aware of, is in 1495, the Spanish actually mixed the blood of leprosy patients with wine that they then tried to sell to their French adversaries. And that is something that they did, which isn't necessarily free aid, but it is showing that the wine was being sold, the other side was willing to buy it, and that wine was contaminated. And the same exact scenario could happen during any kind of a large-scale emergency here, where maybe we are in some sort of an embargo, and maybe we are desperate for some kind of, I don't know, feed or grain or something like that in order to keep the livestock alive. And then the foreign adversary says, look, I know we're in a little bit of a predicament here, but we have additional supplies that we can sell to you because honestly, capitalism still has to keep moving forward, right? Well, just be aware of what that feed or grain might be on the other end once that stuff comes into port. These are things we have to consider. This has been utilized time and time again throughout history, okay? Back in 1863, the Confederates sold clothing that were infested with hay fever and smallpox to Union troops. And that's another way that they use the same style of the smallpox blanket strategy to try to sicken the Union soldiers at that time. And this is just something that happens over and over again throughout history that we need to understand is something that could easily keep moving forward, okay? These things are strategies that are already being implemented in many ways. And we need to be very aware of it, okay? And honestly, when we're talking about history, there's so many examples of this happening that it shows us time and time again that prepping isn't just about having additional supplies. It's about avoiding situations that put you in precarious predicaments because of your lack of preparedness, which is exactly what all this was. And the poisoning the well tactic goes all the way back to 1155, where Emperor Barbarossa used it by throwing human bodies into the wells in Italy when he was on another campaign trying to take over that region. So all these things have been utilized forever. It shouldn't surprise you that this is all happening. And that attack back in February, the cyber attack in Florida, where they tried to poison the water system, utilizing the water treatment center that they actually hacked and then tried to change different levels of different chemicals in order to poison the supply, is just a modern example of that exact same strategy. And this is all being utilized right now. But imagine if you're forced to rely on a certain water source, how easily that could be used against you. Imagine if you had to rely on the rations that are being provided to you by some sort of troops, whether or not they're United Nations, a foreign adversary, whether or not they're our own compromised units. Who knows what's going on during those situations? Relying on those rations is rolling the dice of risk and asking yourself whether or not they're poison or if they're clean. These are a lot of things you have to consider and be very aware of, okay? And understand that as of right now, in this modern situation, accepting free aid, accepting anything free, accepting money or incentives or whatever it might be, comes along with a lot of strings attached. And you have to understand that these are the situations we prepare for, where you might be having the carrot dangled in front of you right now, but what is it you're going to be required to do after taking the carrot? Are you going to have to comply with something that you might not have otherwise complied with? Are you going to have to abide by certain restrictions or guidelines that you weren't necessarily looking to abide by? Are you going to have to put you and your family into a predicament that you didn't necessarily need to be in, but you really needed that extra food or water or whatever it might be, and now you're required to do something that you weren't necessarily wanting to do before? These are all things we definitely have to consider. This is a necessity for everyone in the preparedness community to understand. It's not just about preparing for not having enough food. It's not just about preparing for not having enough water. It's about preparing for not having to make decisions based on what somebody else can force you into because of not having the supplies you need. And this is something I wanted to bring up because there are a lot of dangers associated with free aid. And as we know, even when it comes to mafias or mobs in the sense of crime, often once you ask for protection, you no longer have the ability to ask for that protection to leave. And in fact, you're generally charged for it whether or not you need it, and you don't really have a choice as whether or not you're going to pay. So these are exactly the situations that are happening right now in our modern era that have historical reference to show you why you should be concerned and why you should be prepared and not want to be in a position to ever have to say yes to something that you don't want to say yes to just because you need food or water or whatever it may be. And this is definitely something we all have to be aware of right now. So Let me know if you know of any other historical references where aid has been given for free with malicious intent down in the comments below. And let's talk about how we can learn from history in this regard and prepare for what's happening right now in the same way. There's a lot of different things happening in the world where you have to be ready to take care of yourself so you don't have to fall into any of these pitfalls that we talked about here in this video. And if you have anything else for me at all, magicprepper.com is a great place to get a hold of me. The Patreon is doing really well, and we have our own chat that we like to hang out in. So if you want to be part of that, check us out on Patreon. And understand that all this information is just me trying to give you ideas via historical fact that can help you understand why preparation is so important and why it helps make you as free as possible as an American and as anyone else living in this entire world. So, thank you all so much for the support. Without anything else to say about why you need to prep now so you can avoid free aid during an emergency situation, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.